everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today we're starting a new unit on the law. Specifically how the law affects you, me, society, what the purpose of them is, some interpretations of them over time, what the different versions of them are, Supreme Court cases. We're going to talk about all of that here in this unit. Today specifically, give a little background history of law, kind of, large scale concept over what is law? What is the purpose of laws? Kind of get a precursor, kind of introduction here into this unit on the law and you, which is exactly, not surprisingly, the name of the unit. Civic literacy, the law and you. All right. So, first thing we should talk about is, now, let me start out. I fully expect that you know what a law is. It's a rule, all right? However, we need to kind of talk about what's the purpose of them. Why do they exist? Because if we didn't have laws, things would get pretty crazy pretty quick. And we're actually going to walk through why laws are important and why having rules helps society as a whole. Because without rules, it leads to absolute anarchy. Laws actually, while they seem like, depending on your viewpoint, are restrictive in human nature, the big reason laws exist is so that everybody has rights and that other people can't impede on other people's rights and that we can all work together in a society. Ever since we started farming as humans, we've had job specialization. We've lived in a society. You need to have rules so you know where your boundaries are, so that you don't intrude on somebody else's rights and what they can or can't do, and so they can't intrude on yours. Not surprisingly, humans are very complex creatures. So over time, laws themselves have gotten pretty complex. However, there is some basic unifying concepts that go along with laws, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Kind of the history of laws in large concepts. Obviously, you couldn't go through the history of all laws because we would be here until forever. So, let's start out today by talking about what laws should do. Like, what is the purpose of laws? All right. Laws mainly are designed so that they can ease tensions in between two people. So hey, your tree fell on my goat. Who's at fault? It's your tree. You're supposed to keep it there. And then the guy with the tree is like, your goat wandered in front of my tree and you knew that tree was about to fall down. Like, who's at fault? These are arguments that have taken place since the beginning of time. All right. Now, there is different types of laws and different types of systems. Some systems basically let that situation, we'll just go with that situation, tree falls on neighbor's goat. It'll go to the court system, all right? Now, if there were no laws, they just fight it out in the streets, I guess. But some systems will go to the court system, and the court system decides who's at fault. That seems like a good thing. That's probably a step up from not having any laws. And while that does happen in all societies, the best possible thing is to have a rule in place before this happens. So if the guy that owns the goat knows that if that tree falls down, it's his responsibility if his goat dies because he's responsible for his goat, that's a good thing for the goat owner to know to keep him away from that tree. If the law in that area is that, hey, you have a tree that's dead, you're responsible for any damage that happens if that tree falls, that's good for the guy with the dead tree to know because it might help him prevent that situation from happening by having his tree cut down when he knows the goat isn't around. I'm really going with this tree and goat scenario here, but laws are very necessary in a society to keep structure, keep order, and so that people's rights and privacy aren't infringed upon. All right. So, it is really, really helpful to have your laws written down. It's a big fancy term called Codification of Laws. It is really important to have your laws written down. They've learned this really since Hammurabi's Code, which we'll talk about some here today, actually. it is really important that these laws are written down, because when laws are written down, they're there for everybody. And it helps prevent drama from happening when you know what the rules are. Prevents a lot of bad things from happening, as opposed to just having a tribal council, because it was an olden way of doing things, of just bringing each situation in front of somebody and them making their decision on it. You had more issues that way because nobody ever thought that they were at wrong, because they weren't trying to be negative to somebody else. When you have laws, you know what you're responsible for. So codification of laws and is very beneficial. When they're not written down, you end up having a lot more drama, because when you don't have clearly written down laws, people tend to think they're not at fault because they didn't maliciously try to do something wrong. And then it leads to some tensions in between people. So they've learned really thousands of years ago, writing your laws down and having rules set out in advance of crazy stuff happening typically has society run much smoother. So that's the question here. Why is it necessary for society to have clear laws and punishments? Because there's no point in having laws if there's no consequences to it, which we're going to talk about a little bit today as well. And what happens when laws aren't clearly written down? And we just talked about that a little bit here, basically the necessity of why you need them written down. So explain to me, why would it be bad if you didn't have them written down? So pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. All right, so what makes a good law? Well, let's go through these. The first one is fair. Now, generally speaking, until I talk about Hammurabi's Code and some other stuff, I'm really kind of focusing here on America, because this is civic literacy is for the United States of America. So a lot of my references are going to be modern American references, because law is complex around the world throughout history. So most of my references, unless I specifically state otherwise, will be dealing with American court systems. All right, now, number one thing about having a law that's good in our society is got to be fair. So it's a big thing that shockingly they discovered over time in all societies. Fair laws are the best laws. You may see this statute often, that those scales are supposed to be even, like it's fair, like, you know, the consequence is supposed to fit the crime type thing, like it's even, like it weighs it out, it's even on both sides. Also, the reason she wears a blindfold, she's not playing pin the tail on the donkey, which you may never have played because I might be too old. But she's not playing pin the tail on the donkey. It is the idea that justice is blind. It doesn't matter who you are, in theory, and we're going to talk about later in this unit how hasn't always been the case. The idea is that not only is justice fair, justice is blind. It doesn't matter what color you are, what happened. It is the law. It doesn't really matter what they're seeing. What does the law say and what happened? So number one thing that makes a good law is it's got to be fair. It's got to apply to everybody fairly. All right. The next one is it's got to be reasonable. All right. You can't make a law that says, all right, tomorrow everybody's got to be 6'5". That's completely unreasonable. People can't do that. You can't, you can't make a law. I don't know. I could just get wild with making up ridiculous stuff where everybody's like, that's not reasonable. Good laws have to be reasonable. Because if it's an unreasonable law, you're basically going to be fighting against human nature, and human nature, believe it or not, typically is relatively reasonable. If you pass laws that fight against human nature, it's ineffective law and bad things come out of that. So it's got to be reasonable. It also has to be easy to understand. I'll give you a one that we have talked about here is federalism. The idea that the state governments and the federal governments have to work together. Well, when you interpret things like that, which is going to eventually, the argument over slavery in the United States will eventually lead to the Civil War over who got the final say-so over slavery, the states or the federal government. While 100% the Civil War happened because of slavery, because without slavery the Civil War wouldn't have happened, the idea of federalism got complicated. It seemed like a pretty simple thing. States, federal government work together. They share power. It was complicated. It wasn't easy to understand because they didn't really know, well, who gets the final say-so if you're supposed to work together. So good laws have to be easy to understand. That's probably not the best example because our Constitution is pretty straightforward and easy to understand. But even in a good the Constitution, which is designed to be easy to understand, there is still controversy over what it means. So imagine if there was a very complicated law that didn't really tell you what it could or couldn't do, and you don't know who's at fault, tree guy or goat guy. I'm going to stick with that analogy throughout the course or throughout today's lesson. The next one is enforceable. It's completely unnecessary and ridiculous to have a law that's not enforceable. Like, if you made a law that said you can't think about the color orange. Every time you think about the color orange, it's a $5 fine by the government. Like, how are you going to enforce that? How are you going to know if they're doing it? How are you going to make them pay? Like, so when you make a law, not only does it have to be fair, it has to be easy to understand, it also has to be enforceable. You can't just make an arbitrary law that is not enforceable. So the same thing goes if you passed a law that apply, like if everybody in the country was doing something you didn't want to do, and you passed a law where every single person in the country was breaking the law the next day, but they continued to do it, that would be an unenforceable law because you can't arrest every single person in the country. So good laws have to be enforceable. Now, laws vary around the world. Laws are very, very different from place to place. So here in America, we have our set of laws, and different countries have different laws, and laws are wildly different around the world. All right, and just for reference here, I'll put a map of this. Is just compulsory helmet laws for cyclists. All right, basically, the darker green it is, the more rules there are for bicyclists wearing a helmet. Just this random law is drastically different around the world. All right. Now, why is that? Well, we're just talking about cyclists here. All right. You could really take any law and see how it's different around the world if it exists or not in different places. Laws are created by the culture in which they are designed. So people in America are going to feel different about helmet laws than obviously people in Australia. They are mandatory. It's one of the only places there in South America and southern part of Africa. There are very strict helmet laws. And most of the countries, there's not. What does that probably tell you about that society? Probably tells you they ride bikes a lot more. And they're really concerned about people getting hurt on bicycles. So the reason laws are different is really indicative of their culture and society themselves. So each country can make their own laws. So not all places on earth have the same laws because each society makes their own laws based on what they value and what other places don't. So it just depends on each country's value system. So each country, the reason that's important is each country is required to come up with what they believe is right. So there's not really a blueprint. So if a new issue comes out, you can't just be like, oh, well, what does that country over there do? Not necessarily. You really have to come up with your own society, what your laws are going to be in your own society, and they can vary very widely. And this is just a random example of something simple like helmet laws, wildly different around the world. So the question is, why do laws vary from country to country? And why don't all places on earth have the same laws? And we just got done talking about that. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're going to move on. All right. History of law. We're going to talk about Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi, all right, back in Babylon, one of the first major civilizations near the Tigris and Euphrates River. Don't need to go into all that, but this is the first known codification of laws. One of the things that made Babylon so effective for a long time is Hammurabi and his code. They had codification of laws. They wrote down all the laws. And they realized that when you write down the laws, more people follow them. Instead of just like dealing with it after it happens. And they realized the reason this happens is when people know what the rule is and they know what the consequence is, it's not like they're weighing it out like, am I good with that consequence? Generally people, especially in a society, want to follow the rules. When you spell out what the rules are, typically people follow them. Typically. It also helps you when somebody doesn't follow the rule to basically be able to look at them and be like, you didn't follow the rule, here's the consequence that goes along with it. So Hammurabi's Code is famous for being the first written legal system. One of the most famous codification of laws, however, is actually the Ten Commandments, which are found in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament of the Bible, which is a codification of laws which entire religious groups followed and still do to this day. So codification of laws is just having rules written down, and the Ten Commandments are probably the most famous. But as far as legally enforcing them, and because different countries took the Ten Commandments and interpreted them differently and applied them differently to society, Hammurabi did Hammurabi's Code a very specific way in Babylon, and it is worth talking about. One of the things I thought was really interesting here on Hammurabi's Code, because it's on the stone and it's carved in here for all the people to see, so it applies to everybody equally, is that the eye to eye, that Hammurabi and the God of justice are equal. Now, obviously Hammurabi felt very highly of himself, but the fact on your laws you have a symbol of equality is important, because Hammurabi's like, I'm equal with God, so I have these laws. But he's also saying, because it's almost like the blind justice with the balanced scales, this law applies to everybody. Now, obviously, he's going to think everybody's beneath him because he thinks he's a god. But it is the idea that people are equal under the law, because the laws are under him. So there's 282 laws of Hammurabi. Supposedly, the story is he was given them by the god. I want to give you an example of some of these laws. So you're like, oh, cool, Hammurabi's got codification of laws. They're pretty intense, man. Like if you accidentally break someone's arm, your arm will be broken. If a slave talks back to his master, like, wait a minute, slavery we're talking about, just go with it. All right, there's a lot to unpack here in Babylon. If a slave talks back to his master, his ear will be cut off. What? If you hit your father, your hand will be cut off. What is going on? If you break into somebody's house, they put you to death. You're like, what in the world? Now, yes, by today's standards, those are brutal, all right? However, the lasting impact of this is, guess how many times this stuff happened? And, you know, it's gotten interpreted differently throughout time. A lot of times people say an interpretation, the reason slaves didn't talk back to the master, which slavery then is different than slavery in the United States. The chattel slavery where you're born. If your concept of slavery is just a chattel slavery in the United States in the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, 1500s, that is the most extreme version of slavery. Slavery over time, a lot of people. Anyway, so slavery is different around the world. The one in America is probably the most intense. So slaves would be able to have some rights in court and would be able to read and things like that in Babylon. Whole side story there. The word slave threw me off. Anyway, the reason these laws weren't broken real often, a lot of people interpreted as, look how brutal those consequences are, and that's why people didn't do it. More of our school of thought in America is honestly the biggest reason that people didn't break the laws is because they knew it was wrong. Like you're not supposed to, like, there's a consequence. Regardless how brutal the consequences are, they cut off a finger or cut off a hand, probably wouldn't change the amount of people who broke the law to begin with. That is kind of America's view on this, that having a codification of laws, people generally want to follow laws to be a part of society, generally speaking. If people decide to break a law, a lot of times it doesn't really matter what the consequence is, they're going to break the law for a variety of reasons, accidental or otherwise. But having written laws greatly improves society because it lets everybody knows what you can do and what you can't do, and people generally want to follow the rules in a society and work together for a society. So the question is, even though by modern standards the laws, talk about Hammurabi's code, was brutal, why did having a written set of laws greatly improve society? All right, so pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. All right. Roman law. So Rome owned a lot, owned most of the world at one point of the known world. When Rome would take over other civilizations, they would basically conquer an entire civilization. But Rome was different. Rome wasn't the first place to go and conquer people. Alexander the Great had done it. And even Alexander the Great is not a great example here because he was relatively understanding. Rome would take over an area, conquer them in battle, and say, all right, now you're going to be citizens of Rome. Or you have a process you can become a citizen. This is one of the unique things about Rome, is if you got beat by Rome, they didn't come out and like behead everybody and be crazy. Like, all right, we now own you. And if you behave yourself, you can be a citizen of Rome too. And they will bring that society they conquered into Rome. Now, all these different societies had very different laws. And while, yeah, you had to follow Roman law, it got really complex when you have old laws, new laws, Roman laws, the conquered people's laws. So Rome's laws got really complicated. This is a very complex society. It was huge. All different types of cultures. You know, some people live on the ocean. Some people had struggle getting to water. And so different people had different laws and different things that applied to them. And Rome tried to have like a single set of laws that applied to everybody. Ended up being extremely complex. So one of the more famous things that happened kind of on the downside of Rome's whole nother story is the Byzantine Empire. Justinian's Code. Byzantine Empire, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian, realized that one of the issues that was happening as it collapsed was that the laws are too complicated. Because remember, you got to keep them simple and for people to understand. The Roman laws had gotten really complex. So Justinian really is going to take those laws and simplify them down. Doesn't really help Rome. Maybe it helps them stay afloat a little bit. They're going to collapse. But taking all these different complex ideas and really getting all the best brains around to create a new codification of laws, which is called Justinian's Code, a lot of those laws apply to a lot of Western cultures today. And a lot of American laws you can trace back to, not that we just copied what Rome did, but Rome, thousands of years ago, and the Byzantine Empire, they had a lot of the same issues that we have today. Messing with somebody else's property, theft, adultery, murder. How do you deal with these things in the court system if they make it to the court system? And Justinian really did a lot of analyzing and putting it together and coming up with the best outcomes of the codification of laws. And a lot of our laws today are based off of the things that Justinian Code came up with at the end, near the end of the Roman Empire. So Justinian Code is an awesome picture of Justinian Code. I have no idea if this is anything like he looks or not. But he tried to simplify laws, make them better. It's a lasting effect on law really from this point moving forward. It doesn't really help save the Roman Empire. But the laws of Justinian Code are very, very complex entities simplified down, and the format that Justinian's Code is, a lot of our laws apply today. So there is one other very important thing we need to talk about today. So Justinian Code, we're going to talk about these laws, tort reform, or tort law and civil law and criminal law. We're going to talk about that over the next couple of days. These are all laws that are on the books. Here's the law. Here's what happens if you break the law. Here's the consequence and all that. Well, there's a big part of our society that deals with common law. And this is something that's really hard to talk about without getting really complicated into it. So I want to kind of simplify what this is. It's kind of one of those things. It's either really simple or really complicated. I'm going to give you the simple version. You know how we talked about the tree falling on the goat, and they would prefer not to have that go and just some tribal council member decide what the consequence is? That's kind of what common law is. We still use it today. England really committed to this for a long time, but let me simplify it and explain to you the difference in common law and civil law. So civil law is what we're going to talk about most of this unit. Laws that are written in stone. Here's what happens. You know, here's consequence. Here's how it's set up in the world. Common law is, say, a tree falls on a goat, and the dude of the tree is found guilty. Say there's no law. So the judge is like, all right, guy with the tree, you owe that guy $50. It's the cost of the goat. You owe him $50. You're at fault. Hit a little gavel. Well, then say, next year, another tree falls on another goat. And it goes back to court. But there's still no law on what happens. You know how the judge comes up with his ruling? He sees if it's ever been done before. He's like, hey, last year, tree fell on a goat. That judge said that the dude with the tree is at fault and he had to pay the goat guy $50. Most of the time, guess what the ruling's going to be? You got to pay the guy with the goat $50. Because judges have made that ruling before, it's kind of a precedent. And if that happens enough, that's just the law. To the point where if somebody's like, guy with the goat, you owe tree man, money, I don't know, $20. You owe him. You could actually challenge that in an appeal because the common law it's always been this way, and it holds up in court as common law. If the judges collectively over time have ruled the same way on something, it's the same as if it is a written law. So common law is a huge part, even in our society today. England was really big into that, of kind of letting the judges in individual situations kind of write the law. But it's a hard thing to go through and talk about individual circumstances with common law. And common law usually plays a part when there is not a written law to apply to a situation. So the question here is, while common law isn't always as clear as a law passed by a government in all situations, why is common law an effective way for society to come up with laws that reflect their ways of living? You're like, that's a really long question. It's pretty straightforward, though. Why $50 for a goat? Depending on what part of the country you are or what part of the world you're in, depends on the value of a goat. That amount of money could be different. Since common law is based on individual real events and not just ideology before they happen, the results are usually pretty fair. The downside to common law is you don't really know what the result's going to be until you have, 25 of those instances. But common law is an effective way of coming up with laws because you're looking at the value of society and what we value as a person. Depending on how much you value goats, or depending on where you are, maybe that tree was really valuable. So, answer that completely. That's as far as we're going to get today. And I'll see you guys tomorrow.